Yeah?
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Denton Pendergast, and I'm from the Victoria Harbour History Society, and I'm pleased to be with you both, all of you today to talk to you about the harbour in conjunction with the Thermopylae Club. And it's the history of the harbour and our harbour heroes that we'll be speaking about today. But before we begin, I'd like to take a moment and speak about the 72 plaques that line the inner harbour. As some of you might know, Victoria has no museum of her own. And there are 72 bronze plaques down there across from the legislature and the Empress. And they document the historic accomplishments, events, and the seafarers of note that have lived or passed through our harbour. It is, to my mind, the only, or at least the most significant public display of Victoria's history in the whole city. Now, with that said, I'll get off that soapbox and we'll talk a bit about my partners in this project, the Thermopylae Club. The Thermopylae Club has been meeting since 1932, and is a membership comprised of retired and active servicemen, ferry personnel, fisher people, and yachtsfolk and adventurers. We have a number of people in the club who have solo circumnavigated the globe, a couple of them nonstop. So very significant people in the maritime world. And some of them are commemorated on that wall that we talked about a little bit earlier. And the Thermopylae Club is named after a vessel called the Thermopylae, which was the fastest sailing ship in the history of the world. The only vessel that tried to, or that approached her in speed did not so in reliability, and that was the Cutty Sark. And the Cutty Sark, of course, is famous because she gets a scotch named after her, where the Thermopylae is merely a battle that happened thousands of years ago in Greece. A heroic battle at that. It's an interesting fact that the Cutty Sark in Gaelic means a short night dress. So both vessels and many others were built from the 1860s on to compete in the China to London tea trade, because as we all know, tea was all the rage in England, and there was nothing more fashionable than having the freshest of this year's crop of tea to be served in the dining rooms and sitting rooms of the hoi polloi of England. And combined with, of course, the natural tendency of all sailors to race any other boat that happens to be nearby, which goes on to this very day, of course. So as the Thermopylae, as the tea trade wound down as far as sailing ships is concerned, and that was because the Suez Canal went through, cutting off thousands of miles from going around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa, and also the invention and the reliability of steam. Both of those things spelt a death knell for the great sailing ships of yesteryear. And they all went on to do secondary and tertiary kind of transport trade. The Thermopylae was bought by a company in Montreal, and she was home harbored here in Victoria. And her route was from Victoria over to the Orient, where she delivered loads of our fabulous cedar. And then she brought back 100-pound bags of rice. And that rice was then transported up to the rice mill, which the Montreal company's rice mill, which is now, of course, Capital Iron. And so the Thermopylae would come into the inner harbor, transit across under the old bridge, and tie up at a wharf behind what is now Capital Iron, where the rice would be taken ashore, would be cleaned, would be bagged in smaller bags, branded as dainty rice, and was then shipped primarily to Ontario and Quebec by CP Rail. And again, another example of one of the bronze plaques down on the Inner Harbour. This one commemorating the Thermopylae Club, and was donated by, the vessel of Thermopylae, and was donated by the Thermopylae Club. Moving on a bit, up until the late 1950s or so, much of Victoria's economy looked in some way or other to the harbour. And then as the economic power began to shift, the city was turned its back more or less on the harbour and was looking shoreward for business and economic growth. But thanks to the GVHA, the Harbour Authority, the Relmax Group, which is Point Hope Shipyard and a number of other operations, Black Ball Ferry, the Harbour Air, Clipper Vacations, and many others, the harbour is regaining its vibrancy and a new interpretation of relevancy, which is great. So the next thing I'd like to do is take you back about at least 1,000 years, well, maybe 500. And we'll take a look at the harbour as it stands. That's the natural harbour shoreline. We can see this is where the bridge would be. This is Shoal Point here. This is called Major Bay. We'll talk about that again. So this is the middle harbour. This is the inner harbour. This is the upper harbour. Now I'm going to transit along or leap ahead to 1940 so that we can see what the shoreline looked like when the harbour was really a going concern as far as economic activity was concerned. So, and you'll notice, I'm going to switch back just for a sec here so you can see that there's been infill. And you can also see, oh, sorry. Oh, man. You can see along here, I've got these in the wrong order, my apologies. I knew that had happened. I'm afraid I screwed that up. Anyway, along here, particularly, there were hundreds, well, maybe not hundreds, but certainly scores of wharves and docks, each of which serviced a different kind of industry, from swift meatpacking plants to up in the upper harbor, there were a lot of sawmills creating lumber that would be shipped out across the world because we have such great trees here. I need to, this is the harbor, sorry, I'm skipping over a part of it, but this is the harbor that we know today. And what I'd like to do again, there's what is the new Blue Bridge. You can see that James Bay now has been filled in. This used to be a great resource for our First Nations as far for food. The comparison between the natural harbor and the harbor as it has been infilled, you can see the amount of infill that's been done. You can see that right here, this was Point Hope. And that's why it's called Point Hitchcock, because it actually was a point. And the shipyard was in this protected bay here to start off with. And now it's built up all along here. So that gives you an idea. There's a number of parking lots along here, as we all know. And if you're like me, you might be shaking your head and going, why don't they build something down there? My gosh, I mean, they're right there on the shore. But it's all loose infill and not really structurally sound land. So I think that that's one of the reasons that we see that. So to go back again to the olden times, this was the harbor that our first heroes inhabited. This is the harbor of the Lekwungen peoples. And the reason that we call, or I interpret them as being amongst the most important of our harbor heroes is the 150 or so years that they endured having their culture close to obliterated, and the fact that they have been able to maintain and now are once again on the rise. The harbor gave them shelter and a moderate climate and abundant food sources both in the harbor and on the hillsides and the land around the harbor. And one of the big examples was the James Bay, which was a mud flat when the tide was out, and that mud flat went all the way back almost to St. Anne's, and that's where they got a predominant quantity of their shellfish. Whenever the tide was out, they'd be down there digging clams and the like. So, and then the world changed in 1842. And Fort Vancouver, the Hudson's Bay headquarters in the Pacific, which went from Hawaii to Alaska, and it was under political siege as the Americans, wanting to claim more and more of the land, developed the Oregon Trail and encouraged thousands of Americans to hit the trail, come out and to homestead in what was called the Columbia region. And it got so that the Hudson's Bay Company knew that they could no longer compete or withstand the influx of folks. And so they moved their fort from Fort Vancouver on the Columbia River up to our harbor and established Fort Victoria. The photograph we're looking at is a photograph that I took 4 years ago of Fort Vancouver down in Washington State. The Americans, wealthy as they are, have rebuilt the whole fort, reconstructed the whole thing. And so there we get to see a little bit of what the fort would have looked like. And as I say, the fort in Vancouver, or Victoria, was just a replica, almost a perfect replica of the fort that they had south of the border. And this, there was, the Hudson's Bay Company, of course, brought with them goods that the First Nations had never seen. One of the things, they didn't have wool here. If they had fabric, it was dog hair or it was cedar woven. And so a Hudson's Bay blanket was a miracle. And the Hudson's Bay Company traded one Hudson's Bay blanket for every 100 poles for the palisade that the First Nations brought to the site. And on it went, trading for axes, mirrors, all of the myriad things. They tried, honest to goodness, from what I understand and what I've read, they tried to limit the alcohol, but I'm sure that there was some of that going on as well. So, as more and more of our Lekwungen friends gathered around the fort, people inside the fort started to get a bit concerned. Number one, because they were being surrounded, and number two, because they were afraid of fire, burning down maybe their palisade. So the second really impact of the Hudson's Bay Company on the Lekwungen peoples was they said, okay, you guys, you got to get out of here. We're moving you across to the Songhees. And here we can see the first bridge going across from what would be Fort Victoria over here, across the bridge, and you can see some of the big houses of the Songhees here. These folks here that are standing here are a place called, in English, the Place of Cradles. And the Place of Cradles, when a young child finally took its first steps, or her first steps, the mother and father would take that kid's cradle and on the outgoing tide perform a ceremony and send that cradle out of the harbor on the tide with prayers of a good life for the child. So, which is a nice story. And then the next thing that happened, of course, or not of course, but the next thing, or the next move that was imposed upon them was from the Songhees to the back of Esquimalt Harbour, where they live now, where they have their headquarters and where most of them live now. And in 1876, the government did the next, or delivered the next blow, which was breaking up all of the land holdings that the First Nations had across British Columbia into small lots like Europeans would be used to. And then, later on, they banned the potlatch. So this is a bunch of potlatch dancers. Here we can see some of the spectators. More spectators up on the bridge, the E&N Railway Bridge, the old E&N Railway Bridge, all watching the spectacle. Because you got to think, back then there was no YouTube. There was, an event like this gathered people from miles and miles and miles around. This was a big deal. But when the potlatch was banned, that broke the system completely. The potlatch, as I understand it, and there's various perspectives on it, was in its purest form the economic engine wherein the wealthy divested some of their wealth to the less wealthy to keep the economy and the whole society in a stable format. So without the potlatch, the economic system of the First Nations hunter and gathering people was broken, sadly. And then along came a number of individuals who were the supervisors of what became the reserve system, where the entire province was broken up, or not the whole entire province, but reserves were established across the province, and all of the First Nations people were herded into there. And they were not allowed to then hunt or fish. They weren't allowed to hunt and gather anymore, as they were on these reserves. And that broke it completely. And where once there was a vibrant community of an estimated around 8,500 people, by 1920 there were about 200 suffering souls left in the around the harbor from the First Nations. And so it was for almost 100 years. And until the leadership within the First Nations culture, with the support of all levels of government, have been nurturing the original cultures, the Aboriginal cultures, back to some semblance of vibrancy. This is a picture of the Songhees Wellness Center over in the back of the harbor, of Esquimalt Harbour, where they have a gymnasium, they have meetings and classrooms and organizational facilities. And so today there are over 530 actual members of the two peoples, the Songhees and the Esquimalt bands. And they're on the ascendancy because of their endurance over all of that time and the support that they're now getting from, like, Relmax. Relmax group of companies is established, has given them their very own company that does all of the dredging and pile driving that's needed in the southern Gulf Islands, and that sort of thing's going on. So I don't want to. I've been harping away on this part, probably a little long, but I wanted to really drive home the fact that they are the first heroes of the harbor, in my estimation. And then we move on to a European woman by the name of Sarah Creese. And She immigrated to Fort Victoria in 1860 as the wife of one of the Victorian governing class here in town. And the primary reason that she is one of our heroes is because she documented life in the Victoria area, European life in the Victoria era before there were cameras. And so she wrote, this is Yates Street, a painting of hers, and it's the best documentation of the early days of settlement that we have is from Sarah. And she wrote hundreds of little vignettes and did drawings and watercolors as a lady of breeding was expected to do in Victorian times. Those were to be able to write, to paint, poetry. These were almost incumbent upon Victorian ladies, and she brought that skill to Victoria. This is my favorite hero. This is Captain William Moore, and he left Germany chasing gold rushes from San Francisco, too late, Peru, too late, Queen Charlotte Islands, too late, finally hits the sweet spot in Victoria for the Fraser River Gold Rush. He was a steamship captain, he was a trailblazer, a land speculator, and an entrepreneur. And as it got around that gold was available, there was gold, and then our hills, or up then our rivers, the Fraser River. Governor Douglas decreed, in fact, that if you wanted to go over and search for gold on the Fraser, you had to come to Victoria first and get a license. Most people did. A lot of people took the shortcut and just went. Particularly many of the tens of thousands of out of fortune prospectors from the 1849 San Francisco gold rush all moved up here. Within months, there were over 10,000 new people in a town of 700. Oh. And so we had our first homeless encampments, kind of. So this is a picture of the old customs building, or the Malahat building down on Wharf Street, the red painted building, which was the first Dominion building to be constructed in Victoria. And here are some of the hopefuls going to get their licenses so they could go over and strike it rich in the gold rush. Our friend Moore, rather than joining the hordes, invested in a barge that he had built called the Bluebird, and he schlepped people from Victoria over to Yale and Fort Yale and New Westminster up on the Fraser River, which were the sort of capitals of the gold rush at the time. Though at that time, we have to remember that there were only two cities on all of the west coast of North America. There was Victoria and there was San Francisco. Seattle was just a lumber town, if even a town. Vancouver was not. It was still gas town, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So our friend Moore then commissioned a fellow by the name of James Trahey to build him a succession of 8 different steamboats as time went by. And this is the western slope. You'll notice here this smear of smoke. And that's only because of the slow speed of lenses in those days. And so it wouldn't be, this is an inaccurate representation of the kind of smoke that would be steaming from it. There was a fellow by the name of Shreve, and he lived early on. The Mississippi River, like the Fraser, was unnavigable to deep hull ships. And Shreve came up with the idea, and Shreveport is named after him, that he just build a really flat-bottom barge. And rather than putting the engine inside the hull, which had been conventional thinking, he put the engine on top of the hull in this area right here. And if you ever see any Mississippi steamboats or Fraser River steamboats or any other steamboat really, you'll find that there will always be a door, a big opening at the back, and there'll be a big opening at the front on that floor, or on that deck, because as she steamed along, that would bring stream cool air into the boilers, the boiler area. The wood would be stored in here as well. Passenger deck up here, and that very, very shallow hull, so that they could just get nose right up against the shore. Here, this picture's at Yale, and put their gangplank down so that they could load or unload goods, or at the back, they would put the gangplank down so that they could load wood before coal became a standard. And this is obviously a stern wheeler. So once Moore would get all of these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people across for a fee, they would then take all their gear and start moving upstream to try and find a claim of their own. Dreams of gold and riches in their heads. I mentioned a guy by the name of James Trahey. This is a fisherman's wharf in the 1950s. This is called Major Bay down in here. Major Bay was filled in and ultimately became, just in the last 5 years or so, this whole land up here became what's known now as the Fisherman's Wharf Park. And in the middle of Fisherman's Wharf Park, you might know that there is a deep depression that they've constructed in there, and it's deeper than the water table, which is the same water table as we have here, except now it's fresh water in the hole in the park, and they have all of this freshwater vegetation growing in there. So James Trahey built almost all of the early and mid-early steamboats that steamed out of Victoria's Harbour. So he built probably 25 or 30 boats. Just again, this is Major Bay right here. This is Shoal Point. And you can see there's even a stream in here that's no longer there now. Or it probably is, but it's in a culvert, I would imagine. So back to our friend Captain Moore. Birds of a feather kind of flocked together, and one of his best friends was a fellow by the name of Gassy Jack, who ended up being a skipper on a number of Moore's boats before he jumped ship and founded Gastown, which became Granville, which became Vancouver. And he was known as Gassy Jack because apparently he was quite the storyteller, a talkative lad. Another pal of our friend Moore's was Skookum Jim. And Moore was a financial backer of Skookum Jim's explorations to try and find a way to the Klondike, the gold fields of the Klondike. So the gold fields all through there, Cassiar and up north and the Fraser, all of these gold rushes were really a significant economic driver for Victoria. But this is going a little farther afield now, and he's only included because he's a pal of our friend Moore's. But with money that Moore had helped Skookum Jim founded the White Pass Trail, which is pretty famous in Yukon circles. So each of those men, to be able to go into the gold rush, they had to take something like 2 tons of material each with them, because it was snowed. It was not nice up there, and they had to have all their gear. And so each of these men would probably have made 10 trips, leaving one of their partners at the top to guard their gear until they'd made all of the gear, all of the trips that they needed to do. And then on the far side, down to the river and off they would go. with hopes and dreams of gold. And Moore moved north as well, and he ended up building a house and buying a bunch of land, and that land eventually became Skagway, Alaska, and he lived in Skagway. He was the first resident, and he lived there until his old age, and then as he needed more and more health care, he moved back down to Victoria, passed away, and is buried in Ross Bay Cemetery. New hero. This is the Bride Ship Town Tynemouth. First, I couldn't find a picture of the Tynemouth anywhere, but this is a pretty good representation of the sort of vessel the Tynemouth was. You can see that she has a smokestack here, and so she's steam driven with a propeller, which was huge new technology that had taken over from the paddle wheel, and it was the screw propeller that allowed for ocean travel, because you couldn't really do that with a side wheeler or a, well, I shouldn't say that because there were a few famous ones. However, this is a representation of the Tynemouth. And I have to read a bit of this for you. Decades before Amelia Pankhurst established the suffragettes, probably about 50 years before, a woman by the name of Maria Rye, R-Y-E, founded the Female Immigration Society. And it was her thought in hidebound Victorian culture that there were a number of hugely talented upper and middle class women who could not achieve their potential within the existing system. And she was an advocate for helping them to immigrate to the colonies, which of course British colonies were all over the world, where they might self-actualize in a more dynamic way. And at the same time, there was a woman by the name of Baroness Burdett Coutts, who was the wealthiest woman in all of England, which was pretty wealthy. And she was a friend of Charles Dickens, and she championed the welfare of working class women around the same time, almost parallel to our friend Rye. And we know Burdett Coutts also because in 1857 she plunked down a good portion of the money it took to build Christchurch Cathedral here in town. And in honor of that, the street right next to the cathedral, Burdett Street, is named after her. So between the two of them, they put 40 women aboard the Tynemouth. And off the Tynemouth goes for a 99-day sail down around the tip of Cape Horn, South America, back up, stopping in for fresh water and the sort at San Francisco, and then up to Victoria, where all but one of the women who had embarked disembarked, and one had sadly died. I gave a lot of thought to this, and everywhere you look about this story, it's always called the bride ships. And I kind of bit that hook at the beginning, but the more I thought about it, I said, well, like, with the number of men in England, why would any woman jump on board a sailing ship, sail halfway around the world, literally, endure the sort of dangers that were extant in that journey, just to find a husband? Well, that just didn't make sense to me. And so I think Bride Ships is a really catchy title, and it's romantic, and it sticks with you. But these were brave women, both the upper class women that came with the Rye group and the Burdett Coutts group that came. All of them came seeking a better life. Each one of those women was brave beyond compare. Left their homes, left everything there was no atlas and there was no National Geographic to see where they were going. Off they went into the wilderness of the unknown across two oceans to get to a place where they might have a better life. Oh. Amongst those that were amongst the Rise group was a woman by the name of Minnie Gillen. And here we see another one of the plaques from down on the harbor. And Millie Gillen's family in 1962 donated a plaque to commemorate her voyage. And she did marry a fellow here, and the two of them managed the Ross Bay Cemetery for about 20 years while she had 13 children in those days. So she was a bit of a spark plug, I would think. And that's the story of the bride ships. Then we move on to the next hero, and this is more or less chronological. And it's R.P. Rithett. And R.P. Rithett was a importer of groceries and liquor into Victoria from San Francisco and from farms he owned in Hawaii. In those days, this is a look at our harbor. We can see this is Shoal Point right here, and one of the most important things to remember in this age or this era was across here was a shoal, and that shoal prevented any deep sea vessels from entering Victoria's inner harbor. So all the ocean shipping that came to Victoria had to settle for the outer harbor. And this is Ogden Point here. And so Rithett, I should go on to this next slide, sorry. This is wintertime down around Ogden Point. So there wasn't a lot of really great anchorages or docking down in the outer harbor. So there was just a minimal amount of sea traffic that came to Victoria. And so Victoria remained its own little town huddled on the coast of a great unexplored wilderness. And Rithett then built there was right about here, there was two, they call them the outer wharves. And those outer wharves were where ships did come in, would dock and unload and load their stuff. Rithett invested his money and built Rithett's piers, which went out far longer, so that deep haul ships could actually pull in and dock at those. And in doing so, past the storms, he created an entire new community in this area of the world. And so here we see one of the piers here, and we see the other one of the piers here. And we see that what built up around his piers, as by 1910, over 75 ships a month were coming into Victoria, transforming Victoria completely. All of a sudden, the goods of the world were now coming into Victoria. One of my favorite examples is, I don't know if you know what's called the Captain's Restaurant down across from the great big white house right on the harbor towards where the Victoria Clipper docks. Yeah. When that house was built out of local lumber with local talent, all of the stained glass windows, of which I think there were 12 or 14, all of those came across in ships that docked at Rithett's piers. And the great thing about it was each of those stained glass windows was shipped in a case of molasses, so that they wouldn't break. And so the sophistication started to develop in Victoria, all because of Rithett's piers. The next thing that happened, as well as the 75 ships that were bringing things in, they were now exporting primarily our natural resources out to the world, making a whole new class of wealthy ocean or shipping merchants across the Victoria cultural strata. And a number of other businesses started to develop down by the piers that were warehouses, repair shops, and all of that sort of thing. I like this picture because if we look at it, we can see that there's a sailboat. It documents the 4 different means of transportation that were available in those days. So we have a sailboat here, we have a side wheeler here, which was the next evolution up from a sailing ship, and from a side wheeler we went to a stern wheeler, and from a stern wheeler we went to the propeller driven vessel. So those are the 4 types that were available at the time, and some guy, I guess it was a guy, somebody decided to document those in his etching of what Riffitt's Piers looked like. You can go down to, if you're driving down Dallas Road and you're coming up, going west and making the turn so that you're looking at Soul Point, the big condominium, and you can see in the foreground as you make that corner, you'll see the whole Coast Guard station is there. And if you look, a lot of the Coast Guard station is built on Riffitt's Piers, still to this day. So one of the other things that happened with our friend Riffitt's Piers was that was the beginning of immigration into Western Canada. Here is the Canadian Pacific built 3 liners, the Empress of Japan, the Empress of China, and the Empress of Russia. And we look at these and we can see like this is a transitional vessel like Jules Verne would think of or something. It still has the vestige of a schooner bow, it has a bowsprit, and it has masts that I imagine in a pinch they might have been able to hang some sails from. But she's a legitimate steamboat, steamer. And she would bring, or they would bring, between the 3 of them, immigrants into town. But of course, there was no vaccines back then. And so the only defense against a virus or I was going to say a pandemic, but an epidemic was quarantine. And so the federal government, or the Dominion government as it was at the day, established a quarantine station at William Head, which is now the penitentiary up there, since they still own the land. And the idea was that all of the ships that were coming to Victoria would have to stop here, unload all of their passengers. The first class passengers lived in little homes for 3 weeks. The second class passengers in barracks, and the third class passengers in tents. And after 3 weeks, if you still displayed no symptoms of some weird disease, then you were transported across to Victoria. Another just a little note is Little Darcy Island, which is just up the way in the Gulf of Georgia, in the Strait of Georgia, was the leper colony for this neck of the woods. And they moved that leper colony from Little Darcy Island down to off of William Head. And at any rate, get back to the story. As you were deemed to be healthy, you were then transported across to Victoria. And here we have Dallas Road right here. And there's a set of condos right across the street from what was Riffitt's Piers and is now Coast Guard Station. And before the condos, there was nothing but a big field there for many years. And before that, there was the building that was the first Dominion immigration processing station in Canada, in Western Canada. And this wall along here is a remnant from that station. And if you look right here, there's a plaque commemorating the fact that that was the immigration station for Victoria. So that's our friend Riffitt, and just one last shot. That's the Riffitt building down on Wharf Street, where he warehoused and wheeled and dealed and did all of his work, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And of course, once again, we have a bronze plaque for Rithon. Sorry, I got distracted. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Joseph and Marguerite Spratt. Captain Spratt moved to San Francisco from England in 1863 and established the Albion Foundry. And he built the first steam locomotive that was built on the west coast of North America. And after the gold rush of 1849, and with the beginning of the Fraser River gold rush, he decided that he would move to Victoria. And he built a new foundry here. And this is a picture of the foundry at the time. You can see here all of the ingots of iron that he would have been melting down to make stoves and coal scuttles and whatever else was needed by Victorians at the time. And it's interesting because when we think about it, every community across really in North America either had or was located close to a center where the necessities of life could be manufactured. So if you wanted soap, you had to have a soap factory. You didn't go to the store and get some Ivory soap. If you want anything you wanted, if it wasn't manufactured within I'm just guessing, maybe 50-mile radius, 100-mile radius, because there was no sophistication of transportation back then on trains and that sort of thing. Everything that you had before importation became the thing had to be built where you lived. And so that was one of the most important, made Albion iron one of the most important businesses in town, and really the first heavy industry in Victoria. You can see the boardwalk, sidewalks. And as the captain, he died prematurely, and his wife Marguerite took over. But before he died, he had established VMD, the Victoria Machine Depot. And if you talk to anybody that is a native of Victoria, everybody has a story about VMD. It was, probably the largest employer in town, and was a significant enterprise. And Marguerite ran the thing, and she employed hundreds of Victorians, and was, as far as I can find out, the only female shipyard owner in North America. And she died a multi-millionaire. I'm not sure where her house was yet. I'm researching that. But she gave all of her money to the Humane Society, other than the money that she blocked aside to keep her house running, and keep a housekeeper in the house, and for her little dog to have the best of food until the little dog died. And that's our friend Marguerite and her good heart. One of the things that VMD did build, and they built many, many ships, and we'll talk about a couple of them a little later in the presentation, was the first BC ferry, and that was the Queen of Sydney. And her sister, the Queen of Tsawwassen, was built in Burrard shipyards over on the mainland, spreading the wealth between the two cities, as it were. And both of those vessels were patterned after the Coho, which still runs today. The difference between the Coho, there's a number of differences, but the primary difference between the Coho and the Queens was the Queens were both front and rear roll on, roll off, where the Coho was side, as many of you have been on it know. But so the Coho, and she's owned by Blackball Transportation, and she is literally, you talk to those guys, that 2 or 3 generations of people that you can still talk to, they revere that ship. They just love their ship, and they love Spalding, the guy that built her, and they're just a wonderful bunch of seafaring folk. So just to wrap up with our friend Spratz, I wanted to show you down on Discovery Street to this day. There's this little red brick building, and there are some of the original industrial parts of Victoria right in here. So you can drive down there and see that. Being a curious sort of fellow, and with the carte blanche of saying I'm a historian, I just wander in anywhere I want and try and talk to people. And when I was in this building, the guy and they still cast aluminum mostly now. I went in just to see what it was like inside because I love the look of the building. And the guy said, "Oh, you should go upstairs." I said, "Oh, okay." So up I go, and the whole upstairs, which is about the size of this room, is filled with thousands of wooden patterns that could be cast in sand so that they could pour metal in to make elbow joints of this diameter or that diameter, or pipes of this, or just anything you could possibly name that would be aboard a vessel. And they're all there, beautiful hardwood carved pieces of wood, really wonderful. And so anyway, that's our story of the Spratz. And then we can move along, if you don't mind, to Captain Jacobson. Back before 1867, when Russia sold Alaska to the Americans, there was a great sealing industry. They were called pelagic fur seals. Pelagic meaning open ocean, and these fur seals were large animals with pelts, because they were open ocean, that were superseded the beaver pelt by like a lot, and so they were very, very valuable. And so there was a fleet of sealing ships. Here we see them all lined up ready for the next sealing season. They'd sail out of Victoria up to what were called the Pribilof Islands, and they would just have at her. It was the breeding grounds of the fur seal, and so they were all there, and they were all whelping, and the fathers were there, and the mothers were there, and the kids were there, and they were all getting murdered, and the sealers would go out in dories, much as they did on the East Coast from their schooners, though would just row ashore silently and start harpooning away. And they had to harpoon because once one of these seals was killed, its tendency was just to sink like a stone. And so at any rate, they would gather up a year's worth of seal pelts and bring them back to Victoria for processing, until the Americans said, "That's just not cricket, you guys," and stopped the sealing hunt. That said, our friend Captain Jacobson, one of the most successful of the seal hunters, and I don't want to impose today's morality on yesterday's commerce. He was quite a guy, and he was a member of the Thermopylae Club, and that we mentioned earlier. And there was a vessel that was brought ashore here called the Tillicum. And the Tillicum was, he should be a harbor hero too, but I didn't include him on this particular round. Captain Voss was his name, and he bought an old dugout canoe. And it was right around the time that the first man had sailed around the world alone on a vessel called the Spray. And that had captured the imagination of Captain Voss, and he wanted to do it. But he was a bit low budget, so he bought this or he bought a First Nations canoe, re-rigged it as a sailboat, and with a succession of first mates, he tried to sail it around the world, and he got as far as England. So he got across the Pacific, across the Indian Ocean, and up to London. And then I don't know why, there's a really good book that has just been written on it, but I don't know why he stopped there. I'm sure he might have been just sick and tired of the whole thing. But he left the boat there. Eventually the Thermopylae Club heard that the boat was just rotting on the side of the Thames, paid for it to be brought around to Victoria. Captain Jacobson, in his elder years, was in charge of, as a Thermopylae Club member, of the restoration of the Tillicum that sat in the Maritime Museum for many years when it was on Bastion Square, and is now being housed, courtesy of the Greater Victoria Harbour Authority, in one of their warehouses down in Longton Point, awaiting a new home for the museum. So this guy was, one of the things he did was, while living aboard his sailing schooner, he built this house, which is still there over in West Bay. You might know it, and if you don't, it's worth a drive over there to see how beautifully it's been restored. And it's a lovely, lovely home. And so he's one of our heroes as well. I'm going to move on past the sailing, or the sealing fleet, and our next hero, who's Eddie Hubbard. And Eddie Hubbard was Bill Boeing's first test pilot. And one thing led to another, and Eddie managed to land a contract for airmail from Seattle to Victoria. And in doing that, he had to go to his pal Bill Boeing and ask him to build him a plane. And Bill built B-1. Bill built B-1. And this is B-1 right here, the first commercial aircraft that Boeing ever built. And she's plywood on the bottom. She's framed and canvas along here. She's got a pusher motor here with her radiator up here. And over the next 5 years, our friend Eddie flew close to 50 tons of mail from Seattle to Victoria. And the reason that the Americans were so keen on getting their mail from Seattle to Victoria was Victoria was the last stop for those ocean liners, the only scheduled ocean liners across the Pacific that were sailing at that time, and that was the Princess of Victoria, the Empress of Japan, China, and Russia. And so all the mail that went across from England, from Canada, and the United States that was headed for the Orient, going west, was carried on those three ships. And they were all called RMS, which is Royal Mail Ship, which was a prestigious name for a vessel. And so that's our friend Eddie, and he, during that time, the city fathers, I don't think there were any city mothers then, but the city fathers said, our harbor's going to be like one of the greatest seaplane harbors in the world. So they built this tower that's down at the tourist, and and that was around the time that Charles Lindbergh had just flown across the Atlantic, and he was from St. Louis, and there was a company in St. Louis that, in commemoration of his flight, built the world's most powerful spotlight. And our friends in Victoria heard that and said, we'll need one of those for our airport, our seaplane airport. So they ordered one, and it was delivered, and it was put right up there. The thing that's there now is just sort of a dummy. And you can talk to some of the old timers who will tell you that on New Year's Eve and times of special commemoration, that they'd fire that thing up and it would just light the sky. And so everybody was really thrilled until they noticed that it wasn't safe for seaplanes to land in our harbor because there were too many logs floating around, and so the whole idea went out the window. And that there's a little sort of another little story I'd like to share with you, and that is I was talking to an old guy who was aboard one of the CP Princesses, which were vessels that served the coast, Seattle, Victoria, Vancouver, Upton, and Nanaimo, up the coast. And he was from Vancouver, and he was 17 years old, and he was a hand on one of the Princess liners. And he told me, no, the first time I came into Victoria's Harbour, I don't think I'd ever seen anything as beautiful in my life. And I went, oh, isn't that interesting? And he said, there was an oil slick, and it was like a rainbow, the whole harbor. So that shows you that things have changed a bit. And but back to the B1 for a second. I just wanted to share this. This is the B314, 314th model of plane that Boeing built. And this is the Pan Am Clipper that was built in the 1930s to take the very wealthy from England to New York or from San Francisco to Hong Kong. And it carried 36 people, was the largest plane ever built up to that point. It had lounges, a dining area, a galley that was manned by chefs from four-star hotels. And you can see various cabins. This cabin here at the front was the most prestigious, of course, and it went the whole width of the plane. And then from there back, there was a hallway down between, so it was halfway. And you can see here, there's this is a lounge. And you can see this guy up here. Look, there's a guy in the engine nacelle could go from propeller, from engine to maintain them in the wing, crawling out, I guess, on his belly in the wing to get out to maintain, because you really wouldn't want to be crashing halfway over the Pacific. Anyway, it would cost one way from San Francisco to Hong Kong in 2019 dollars was $14,000 to take the plane. So just an aside on the Bill Boeing front that I thought you might be interested in. And then we move on to our next hero, who is Robert Pym Bouchard. And most people know Robert because he had the limestone quarry up at Brentwood Bay. And he mined that quarry of limestone, had a plant there, and limestone is a fundamental ingredient in Portland cement. And he made Portland cement. And he shipped it from Brentwood Bay to San Francisco, Vancouver, and Seattle, all experiencing big building booms at the time, and made a fortune, an absolute fortune. And at the end of the day, he was left, having exhausted all of the limestone, with a great big hole in the ground. And everybody, or most people, know the name Bouchard because his wife then went in and landscaped it, and it became Bouchard Gardens, which we see one view of here. Fabulous place. But Bouchard Gardens overshadows our friend Pym Bouchard, in as much as in 1914, as England entered the war, one of the things that the British government did was they set up a munitions commission that had a representative in each of the dominions and the colonies, so that each of the dominions and the colonies would be able to provide through a single source whatever material for the war that was required, that was available in that particular location. Our friends here, the shipbuilding was big, wooden ships in particular, because we had some of the greatest wood in the world, and many of the greatest shipbuilders in the world were in Vancouver and Victoria. So they all got together and chipped in and got the best businessman in this region, who was Pym Bouchard, and sent him off down to Toronto to meet a guy by the name of James Flavel, who was the munitions coordinator for Canada, and said, hey, we build really good ships and we'd love to build some ships for the war. And Flavel said, well, we don't need any ships. Thank you. We've got lots of ships. And so our friend Bouchard jumps back in the train and trundles west breaks the bad news to everybody, and goes back to whatever he was going back to, probably scraping the last of the limestone out of his quarry. And then he gets a telegram in 1917 from Flavel saying, "Hey, we need ships." And the ships that they needed were coastal freighters. The German submarines were coming in and sinking as many of the coastal freighters as they could that were transferring goods and material along the coast as they produced material for the war. And so Flavel made Bouchard the commissioner of shipbuilding on the west coast of Canada. And under his leadership, somewhere around 40 to 50 significant vessels were built. There were about 9 that were built here in Victoria, some at the Point Hope ship, what is now the Point Hope shipyard, that had been that was leased by the New York Foundation Company to build ships here. And at any rate, the ships were built, and they were just wooden hulls. And then he negotiated a contract. You'll remember the Victoria Machinery Depot, the foundries. Sorry, I'm ahead of myself here. Here's the VMD again. And they started fabricating boilers for these steamships, and all of the plumbing that was required for any one of these ships. And the ships, go back here, I've got to go back to, sorry. This is the War Yukon. Each of the vessels built in Victoria was called the War of something or other. This is the hull for the War Yukon, having been built at Point Hope shipyards by the foundation company. You can see the dark part. That's how high she's floating in the water. So she's being towed from Point Hope over to VMD, where her boilers and all of her plumbing would have been installed, bringing her water line down to where it should be. She would then be manned and shipped and sail off out of our harbor down to the Panama Canal, through the Panama Canal, up across the Atlantic to England or to one of the Belgium or Holland or one of the Allied countries that were lacking in coastal shipping because of the submarine warfare. And there they would spend the rest of their lives as coastal steamers. There is no plaque as yet for our friend Bouchard on the wall. And the Thermopylae Club and myself as a Victoria Harbour History Society will be working to have a plaque installed. We have identified probably about 15 plaques that should be up that aren't. And so that's the story, or the unsung story of the Bouchards, that you can go and tell your friends when you're up there smelling the roses. Next along the line is Captain James Troop. Troop, when the CP Rail came out and established their western terminus in Vancouver, which made Vancouver a city, and that's when, of course, Vancouver began to eclipse Victoria as the cultural hub and the economic hub out here. But nonetheless, CP bought up a whole bunch of smaller steamship companies that were servicing Seattle and up the coast and Nanaimo and over to Vancouver. There's about 6 or 7 of these companies. And CP bought them all and established the BCCS, the British Columbia Coastal Service. And from the 1910s up until the Princess Marguerite, of which we see here, which was the pride of the fleet and still amongst many is the pride of Victoria. Troop was the fellow that administered and commissioned 17 Princess liners. So you had these liners would be then servicing the whole coast. And there were many, many new communities along the coast that no longer exist, but did exist because there was a steamship company that serviced them. They were logging places and fishing places and all of that sort of commercial activity. In Victoria, he commissioned the building of the steamship terminal. This is the first steamship terminal that was built. You can see, this is, because you can see three funnels here, we know that's the Princess Victoria, which was for a long time the pride of the fleet, and certainly the fastest of her day. And as traffic grew and grew and grew, it outstripped the capacity of this old terminal, and so a second terminal was built, and it's the one we know today. And again, you can see the piers going out where the princesses would all come in to Victoria and leave from Victoria in the inner harbor. So CP had the Empress liners going across the Pacific, and it had the Princess liners servicing the coast. And amongst the Princess liners was the Princess, and I always say Sophia, and everybody looks at me cross-eyed in the maritime community here, because they all call it the Princess Sophia. And the Princess Sophia was a lovely little ship who served well, bringing troops over from Victoria over to Vancouver to get on trains to go to World War I, and just served the coast in a yeoman-like way, until she was steaming back from Alaska, and she went aground during a horrendous storm. And a number of vessels came to her rescue, but they couldn't reach her because of the storm. And she kept her machinery going until anyway she was washed off the reef and was lost with all of the people, passengers and crew aboard, some 300 and some people. And that broke our friend Troop's heart. And he basically, that was really the end of his productive career. And that was the worst accident on the coast. The Maritime Museum of British Columbia very recently, in fact about a year ago, added a plaque to the wall to commemorate the Sophia's loss. That's my moment of silence. My next hero that I'd like to offer up to you is HRH, the Duke of Edinburgh.
Okay.
And I've imposed him here beside one of the Royal Navy buildings out at Esquimalt Naval Base. HRH was out visiting on a royal tour in the 50s and was appalled to learn that we had no maritime museum on this coast, which of course is living up to the fact that we still don't have a museum in Victoria, to harp on that particular. At any rate, HRH goes back to England, gathers together some 300 significant artifacts that are appropriate for particularly the Esquimalt, but on this coast, from the Royal Collection, and has it all shipped out to Esquimalt. One thing leads to another. It becomes the Maritime Museum of British Columbia in Victoria. And the volunteers and the professional staff of the Maritime Museum of British Columbia have, from that time to this, accumulated and have curated over 30,000 artifacts having to do with this coast. And the Maritime Museum, of course, had to move out of its courthouse location on Bastion Square a few years ago. The British Columbia government has been kind and patient enough, as I understand it, to house the collection. The collection curation is ongoing, and the Maritime Museum is in a far smaller location, and they valiantly call themselves, I think, the Information Center. And looking forward to a move to a more appropriate housing that might be outside of Victoria in Langford. Again, Victoria has no museum of its own. Maybe we're allergic to them, I'm not sure. At any rate, that's a little bit of the story of our Maritime Museum and how His Majesty helped us, or His Highness. Martin and Marg Clark, known in the business as M&M, are two Christians who in the early or mid-70s established SALTS, the Sail and Life Training Society, took an old broken down schooner, repaired her over the years, and took many young people to sea for 4-day, 3-day, and 2-week adventure sails, primarily up the Strait of Georgia, in between Vancouver Island and the mainland. From their perspective, a time at sea gave kids an opportunity to be responsible for something, as each member of the crew had to be. It gave them, on occasion, they witnessed the power of nature, and at other times the beauty of nature on a quiet, starlit night anchored somewhere aboard what was, and it really was, a downeaster schooner that had been brought out here. Then Martin and Marg started fundraising, and they built the Pacific Grace, which is the vessel that we see right here in the background. They built her on donated funds over at the, with their own hands and with the group of people that they gathered together at shipwrights at Expo over in Vancouver. And then with that, the ship built, they took the lines off the Robertson II, which was the original schooner, and they built this vessel here, again, with donated funds and a dedicated staff. Here in the Upper Harbour, they built the Pacific Grace, a beautiful vessel. Now, just a little bit of an aside and a reminiscence on my part. I got here just as they were starting to build the vessel from Calgary. And serendipitously, I ended up meeting Martin, and he engaged me as the graphic designer for SALTS. And I didn't know very many people, if hardly anybody, in Victoria, so I would go over there quite often. And they had a great big temporary building built that would accommodate what was going to be the 150-foot hull of this schooner, and up it would rise. And I would go over there sometimes twice a week, just because I was lonely, or because and it became that I was fascinated with watching this one piece of, or this joined piece of wood that was this blue line down the middle of our hall reminds me of it. A piece of wood, a bunch of wood that was segmented about that big, and that was the keel. And I went over there and I watched slowly this whole hull being built. And Martin would almost always take time out to take me back there and show me how and explain how this was being built and whatever. And I can never forget the smell of fresh sawn wood in this great big building that was just filled with classical music all the time. It was just magical. Later on, Martin and Marg were kind enough on my 50th birthday to let me use the Pacific Graces for my birthday venue. And you can't really see the two vessels to their best advantage. By the way, this is the figurehead on the Pacific Swift, and it's Marg. Mm-hmm. And you can see the two vessels, there they are, and you'll see them out and sailing around, either motoring out of the harbor or out in the strait. You will see them. And so this is the Pacific Swift, Pacific Grace, which is the last schooner built, or one of the last schooners ever built, and the only schooner to be built on the West Coast. And Victoria Harbour History donated the money to put the plaque on the wall to commemorate that event. And so I'm going to move on, if I might, to the next hero of the harbor, and that's our friend Blaney Scott. And Blaney Scott was served in World War II. He's an engineer. After the war, came to the West Coast in Calgary and started to commercial fish. Now, back in those days, all the equipment that you needed to fish commercially or on salt water had to be made out of either really good hardwoods or brass. Everything else, of course, was susceptible to the salt water and corrosion. And Blaney was one of the first to start the transition from that far more expensive those far more expensive materials that needed to be constantly maintained to plastic. He was the graduate of Victoria, and he brought in and adapted a plastic injection machine and started to create these sorts of materials. And the one thing he did invent, or amongst the things he invented, was the downrigger. And the downrigger was a godsend for everybody who fished deep with hooks on the coast, because to get down, depending on the tidal current, you had to have heavy weights on your fishing line to get things down to the bottom, so it wasn't hanging out here and it wanted straight down. And that meant you had to put cannonballs that would weigh 10, 20, 30, 40 pounds on the end of your line with your hooks just to get it down to where you wanted the hooks to be. And that meant it was easy to get them down there, but it meant that it was a lot of work to haul them back up. And so Blaney had invented the downrigger so that you use a crank handle to bring the whole rig back up. And I have a little story to tell you about Blaney. When I first got here to the coast, I wanted to buy a boat. And the first boat I bought was from Salts, who was making money and still makes money by selling donated vessels. People will donate their vessel to Salts, they turn around, fix it up if it needs to be, and sell them and use the money to keep their operation running. And I bought a 1914 Royal Navy sailing dinghy that was 15 feet long, and a beautiful little sailboat, and I learned how to sail in her in our outer harbor. And that first year that I had her, I was so excited. I went and I entered the Classic Boat Festival, which I'd heard about ever since I was back living in Ottawa, which is where I lived before I lived in Calgary. I'd heard of this magical festival. So I was just thrilled to be able to be part of it. And there I was in my little Royal Navy sailing dinghy that had a little bit of a crack in it. And so I was sponging her out with a great big sponge. And this guy walks by and he looks down. He's 6 feet tall. He's on the wharf. I'm down in my boat. So he looks down at me and says, "That's a very pretty boat you have there." And I said, "Well, thank you very much, sir." And he carried on. And then about half an hour, 45 minutes later, this kid shows up. And he's got like a plastic bilge pump. And he says, "Mr. Scott wanted you to have this." And it turned out it was Blaney Scott who was watching me sponge my boat out. So I was overcome, and I found out where Blaney would be. And he was aboard his vessel, Messenger 3, which is still a participant in the festival every year and is the judging boat. But she was an old missionary boat, so she'd go up and down the coast preaching the gospel wherever she went. And so Messenger 3. And Blaney was aboard, and I thanked him, and he invited me aboard. I went aboard, and he took me down into the engine room, which was his favorite part of the boat because he's an engineer. And I've never seen anything like this. I'm from Ottawa and then Calgary, and now I'm standing on this little Indian rug in this pristine engine room with all these tools and a little lathe and everything, so he could repair anything at sea that he wanted to. And I'm just looking around and I'm amazed, and I say, "This is amazing, Blaney." And he says, well, Denton, you know what the purpose of a vessel is, don't you? And I kind of go, no. And he says, well, Denton, the primary purpose of a vessel is the safe transportation of our machinery. Which, of course, is an engineer's perspective on what a boat might be. And later on, I had bought another sailboat from Salts, a larger boat that actually had a galley in it. And so I edited that statement to be that the primary purpose of my vessel was the safe transportation of her galley. And so those are fond memories about the wonderful Blaney Scott. And next, and getting towards the end, you'll probably be relieved, is Harry Heine, who was an internationally, he passed away years ago, but he was another gentle and lovely soul on the harbor front, or on the waterfront, and really around the world, because his watercolor paintings are valued in collections around the world. He's the only Canadian watercolorist in the Royal Marine Watercolor Society out of England. He's the only Canadian. And you can see one of his paintings in the background of a Coast Guard vessel. You can see the size of people, and you can see this crane from here down to here hauling this aid to navigation over towards the vessel to be loaded aboard. That's the primary purpose of the Coast Guard station here, is to maintain all of the aids to navigation on the west coast of Canada. Another one of Blaney's paintings, and Blaney's found this is the Princess Marguerite later in her life with her Union Jack stacks. So she, anyway, and the Heine family gave me kind permission to use any of Harry's paintings in my Victoria Harbour website. And all three of Harry's children are really accomplished painters themselves. One of them is, I should have a few samples of their work in there. At any rate, I don't, and you'll be relieved to know that we are reaching the end of this particular presentation. And I just want to acknowledge some of the institutions and organizations that have provided images for what we just endured. And again, these are some of the organizations and people that have supported me, the Thermopylae Club, and the Maritime Museum over the years. And all three organizations are grateful for their participation. And just as a heartfelt plea at the end, please support our maritime heritage through the Maritime Museum of British Columbia. They need all the help that they can get. They're a small organization of dedicated people, and they have a wonderful collection and are just at the beginning of a new growth spurt as they move from their small location up into a new and legitimate location, a location that's appropriate for an organization with 30,000 artifacts. And so please, you can go on to mmbc.ca to see their website, volunteer, give money, just send them a note and say, love what you're doing. If you don't have, if you can't remember that, you can always email me, and I'll be happy to send you the email address for them, and so you get on their mailing list. They have monthly talks now on Zoom, and we'll go back to being. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope you found that interesting.
That was really
very
excellent.
I've
Good.
got a couple questions.
Sure.
First is, you said that the three Royal Mail ships going from Victoria across to the Orient were the only ones? There's nothing out of San Francisco?
Nothing.
So all the mail had to come up through here and across?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the Canadian Pacific. And that was all part of what's known as the All Red Line. And so the idea was that you could go from England across the Atlantic on one of Canadian Pacific's Empress of England, Empress of Ireland, Empress of Scotland. And you would come down to Montreal, you'd jump on a train after you'd spent a night at the Queen Elizabeth, it wasn't the Queen Elizabeth Inn, hotel, jump on a train and go across the continent, staying at CP hotels, the Palliser, the Royal York, the Empress. When you got to Victoria,